in the spring of 2010, I had just gotten back from my deployment in Iraq with the Army, and I was leaving bases. We'll save all the technical military jargon, but I was moving from one base to another. And I was going from Fort Hood, Texas to the panhandle of Florida, so up there near, just south of Pensacola, which has very nice beaches and restaurants and all that stuff, and then we spent all our time in the woods, so defeated most of them. And the type of training we were doing, they put us out in the middle of the woods, super secret squirrel stuff, I guess. So they wanted us out in the middle of the woods so that we could be, you know, with the elements and the crocodiles and the mosquitoes and whatnot. And soon after we got in there, in order to get to where the base is at, they have 3 roads leading to the base. It's very simple, and you really can't get lost because there's only 3 roads. And the roads are called 3, 5, and 9. The reason is because you drive 3 miles through the woods, you take a left, you drive 5 miles through the woods, and you take a right, and you drive 9 miles through the woods. So the Army, being, you know, clearly clever and intelligent, just said, we'll call that 3, 5, and 9. So you go in the woods, you drive off, 3 miles, 5 miles, and 9 miles. And the road is relatively narrow. It's not a very big, it's not a freeway road. It's more of kind of like a country back road, and on either side, the woods are very, very close. And what they want to do is they want to mimic a hostile environment for all the students who are coming in to train at this particular camp that I was at. And so they want to make it to where it doesn't look like people live out there. I mean, they have bears out there, all kind of stuff. Vicious squirrels, what have you. And so soon after I got there, and I didn't really know anything about thick woods, highly vegetated areas. And so we were driving through there, and the road's already narrow. And when we get down 3 Mile, I start to see some smoke. So 3 Mile, and then we're taking a left on a 5 Mile. And as I get on 5 Mile, I get it halfway down 5 Mile, and I just see that it's just completely black. It's the middle of the day. Everything is just blacked out with smoke. And there's fire on my right side and on my left side as I'm driving up to the small camp out there in the middle of the woods. And as I get closer into the smoke, which is what you always want to do when you're driving, especially a small car, you're unfamiliar with the territory, you see a pillar and a cloud of smoke, you don't know what's going on, immediately drive into it at a pretty high rate of speed. It's usually the best thing to do. They will tell us, you know. Firefighters will agree. Drive right into that cloud of smoke. And as I get into the cloud of smoke, I notice that there is just, the right side of the woods is just engulfed in flames. And I thought, well, that's definitely not good. And then I see the left side of the road, and likewise, it is also engulfed in flames. And I'm thinking, what in the world is going on? I've never been here before. The guy with me didn't seem overly alarmed, which was a little alarming to me, that he was completely fine with this situation. I wasn't sure if I was having a stroke or if I'd passed out or what was going on, that I was seeing this. We get deeper, and it's just, it felt like the flames were reaching up over the road and providing a not so safe canopy for me to drive through. And we get to the end, and I'm looking at this guy, and he's cool as a center seat in a cucumber. Not bothered whatsoever, cooler than the other side of the pillow. He's completely comfortable. And we drive through, and I don't want to say anything because I don't want to be the guy who's so soft that I'm afraid to drive through large parts of fire, right? I got to be tough. This is the Army. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to be tough. And we keep driving, and we turn on to 9 Mile, and there's even more flames. I mean, it's just everywhere. I can't see anything. I'm driving super slow, like I slowed down to like 60 miles an hour to drive through this thick smoke. And there's no police out there, so where there's no law, there's no transgression, as we learned from the Old Testament. So we're driving through this thick cloud of smoke, and then we get to the end, and I see just, it seems like it's getting closer, and the road's getting more narrow. And I was like, dude, all right, color me soft, but why are you not upset that it looks like we're driving into Hades itself? And he said, oh, that's a controlled burn. I said, okay, a couple questions. Number one, why didn't you mention that earlier as soon as we hit the cloud of smoke? I felt like that would have been a perfect segue into why we're driving into Satan's lair. But also, more importantly, what is a controlled burn? Because it does not seem like it's a good thing. I think it's also called a prescribed burn. There's a few different cool terms for it, but controlled burn seems a lot cooler. She said, oh, the woods here are really thick. And what they have to do from time to time is they have to come in here and they have to start a fire, a small controlled fire, if there is such a thing, and then it burns through parts of the really highly vegetated area. in order to prevent larger fires from developing later on. And so the idea is, in these woods, it's so thick that it dries out. You have pine cones, you have leaves, you have all this dry material, trees die, things like that. And if you allow it to build up and build up and build up, what happens is a small fire can just erupt, and then you have all this extra fuel that's sitting in the woods that just engulfs it in flames. Now, I'm not going to argue for whether or not we should be doing controlled burns. Apparently, it's a touchy subject online. A bunch of computer nerds are just arguing about it. So I'll let the people who know more about that argue about it. But we got to the end, and sure enough, there was some dude out there who might have been the coolest person I've ever seen. Had a flamethrower, which didn't know that was a job, to just start fires in the woods. I had always been told by a large bear when I was a kid, you're not supposed to do that. He said that I was the only one apparently who could prevent forest fires. So I took that pretty seriously. He had deputized me to do such. And so I thought, okay, well, you're not supposed to do that. And then I realized there's a job of a dude who just goes around the woods with a flamethrower and burns stuff to the ground. And first of all, I was like, what degree do I have to get? Like, where do I have to go? Do I have to learn a new language? Do I have to pay for my own fuel? Either way, this seems like a pretty legit job, right? So it's basically the opposite of a firefighter, essentially. So I don't know, Tom, if you want to look into that. It seems like you might get an extra bonus or something. And he's just torching stuff, right? And then no one really seems alarmed. And so sure enough, he was there, and then we finished 9 Mile, got to the base, and then I just wanted to go back and see like what was going on, how it was going to end up. So it was super cool. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Now, we're going to get into a little bit later, but I'm not telling you to start a forest fire, okay? So some of you in the back, with sunglasses around your neck, maybe wearing a black coat, who like to play golf. I know I can see that look in your eye, that little twinge that says, Josh just said I could start a forest fire. Do not do that, okay? It's not good for the environment, I'm told. But controlled burns. Some plants need fire to actually open up the pine cones that drop from it. So sequoia, I'll take your word for it, but also some species of pine, right? So they have this resin that surrounds the pine, the cone, right, when it drops. And so the heat basically gets rid of the resin and allows the seeds to drop and allows the plant to continue to grow. In fact, some species without fire eventually coming through and kind of renovating the land, then some species will die off. So controlled burns, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're not going to talk too much about fire, so don't get your hopes up, Tom. We're going to segue into something else in Genesis chapter 4, something seemingly completely different, almost jarringly so. But I want you to keep in the back of your mind the idea, and we'll get back to the spiritual aspect of this, which you should have already connected the dots. The idea of letting things build and build, letting dead wood and dead leaves and things build and build and build, and not taking care of those things progressively as you go. And then when a fire comes, it can devastate the land, it can burn up off the topsoil, and then potentially never have anything be able to grow there again. Now, those of you who have been saved for a while or been in church for a while, I don't have to connect these dots for you, right? Those of you who study psychology or sociology, right? I don't have to connect those dots for you explicitly quite yet, but just keep in mind that there are times where you're going to have to do controlled burns in your life to burn away some of those things that are building, some of those weights, some of those sins that develop and sit and fester, the things that we often ignore because we're not willing to pay the price to get rid of them because it would cost us too much because we feel like it's a part of who we are and we're burning away something, some part of who we are. If we let those things fester, if we let those addictions fester, if we let that anger and that bitterness and that jealousy fester, it will just take a spark in some untimely moment, and you find yourself completely devastated by an uncontrolled burn that is completely out of your control, and you're going to be trying to do damage control. So, Genesis chapter 4. I'm just going to we're going to go through verse by verse. You know what? I'll read through it quickly one time. You can remain seated. I'll read through it one time, and then we'll come back through and we'll break it down so you have a sense of the story in your head, okay? And Adam knew his wife Eve. Now, this is just after they had been kicked out of the garden, right? God created Adam and Eve. They created the entire world ex nihilo. That is the Latin phrase for out of completely nothing. God took absolutely nothing and he made something with it. They had just gotten kicked out of the garden for their sin. And in verse number 1 of chapter 4, and Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. He was a farmer, essentially. And in process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, that is, he was furious, he was deeply grieved. And his countenance fell. Countenance means face. So his face fell. That's the idea of deep grief. It's just an idiom, an Old Testament idiom. That means like basically he's very upset or disturbed, angry, those sorts of things. And the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face, from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore whoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Now, a couple of things that we're going to look at before we dive into this. Number one, I want you to notice that there is a narrow focus in this text. There is a narrow focus on specifically Cain. Now, you notice when you read this story, you don't really hear anything about Adam and Eve, right? You hear about Eve having Cain and Abel, and then they're gone. These aren't the only two people on the planet. But the way that you read this story, which is how it was intentionally written, they're the only two people that matter. Cain, Abel, and God. No one else is mentioned. It's what we call a myopic view. That is, it is zoomed in specifically on Cain and Abel. No other extracurricular activities are being recorded. We're not mentioning anyone else on the entire planet Earth. Okay? There's nothing about their families. There's nothing about brothers and sisters and all this stuff. It's just Cain, Abel, God, and then we have their sacrifices. So we're getting rid of any extra information that might not be important to the story and that might distract the reader from understanding what we're supposed to be looking at. Now, I'll have you raise your hands. Who has heard a message on Cain and Abel before? Okay. Who has heard this topic or this specific place preached on more than 3 times, you would say? Okay, 2.5, 2 3/4. All right, we're getting into fractions. If we start including letters and numbers together with math, I'm out. All right? I don't need to relive my statistics nightmare all over again. Okay, so there's a narrow focus. It's interesting that these are the 2 first children of Adam and Eve. It's the first murder ever recorded in the Bible. It's a very intriguing story, but it's only been preached on, I can only think of a few times in my entire life, and I've been in church my entire life, and I can only think of a few times where I've heard it preached where I didn't actually search up a message, right, on Cain and Abel on YouTube or something like that. So that's interesting. Also, it's interesting to note that there is more grief over the life of Cain than there was over the death of Abel. People are more upset that Cain, the actions of Cain and the fact that he's still alive, than they were over the fact that Abel's dead. Why? It's because Abel was favored by God because of his faith. He was protected by God, and there's no concern about where Abel is at today, right? People are not concerned with Abel's fate because he trusted in God. He had faith in God. And even though God allowed him to be killed, which is interesting in this story, that God never went to Abel and said, hey, your brother's really messed up and he's coming for you. You might want to, go to Cle Elum or something, right? Hide out in the woods. Might want to take a hike. No, he only comes to Cain that we see. And he argues with Cain, and he has a conversation with Cain about what's going to be happening next and what his options are. But at no point is Abel given the heads up, right? That's interesting. Look at verse number 1. So we have Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bare a son, or bare Cain, and said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. So the name Cain, it makes us think of the Hebrew word for acquired or gotten. That's the idea behind it. And so names now mean a lot, but in the Old Testament, names meant quite a bit because they had lineage was a big deal, and being named something was a very big deal. And so Cain is named acquired. So why would Cain be named acquired? Well, most people would say that when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, in Genesis chapter 3, we have what's called the proto-evangelium, which is the first mention of the gospel in its very most basic form. That is, God confronts Adam and Eve about their sin because they listened to the serpent. And so he says, one day, you're going to give birth to a child. There's going to be a seed that's coming. And that seed, or that child, which is the same word for the child being brought forth here, is the idea of a seed or a child or a birth. And that child is going to crush the serpent's head. In other words, that child is going to reverse the effects of the fall. So now we look back, because we're all in the future, and we know, oh, that's Jesus. He's going to come in the first century. He's going to lay down his life as a sacrifice, and we're going to have redemption through him, through his blood, through his sacrifice, and then we're going to be able to be engrafted into the family of God. But Adam and Eve didn't know that because, again, they're in the past, they're not in the future yet. They're not reading about their own story in Genesis 4. So very likely Eve thought this is the one that was promised. She thought immediately, boom, here he is, right? Finally waited a couple months and now he's here, and now the Savior's here. But then over the progress of time, she started to realize Cain's not it. Like, this is, no. Most of you who had who've had children, right? You may have had certain expectations for that child. And then as Joel grew older, those expectations were dashed against the stones. And you realize that, he's normal, which is okay, right? And so you don't have too many expectations for the next child that's born. But her hopes were kind of dashed because she expected the Messiah and he did not come. So she acquired a man from the Lord, but it wasn't the promised seed that God had. We also have a dichotomy. We have a comparison between a shepherd and a farmer in verse number 2 and 3, leading up to verse number 4. It discusses their sacrifice. Now, one of the reasons I'm approaching this topic is because I believe that when this is preached, many times the focus is completely lost on what the original author intended for us to take away from this. So many times we hear, well, Abel was righteous and Cain was wicked. Lest we forget, everyone who was born is born into iniquity. Everyone who was born is born into sin. There wasn't something fantastic about Abel that made him not have a sin nature, or that made him above reproach, or that he never made mistakes. So we can't forget that we're dealing with two sinners here who are coming to God and offering sacrifices. And we don't want to say, sometimes this is also said, well, Cain was a farmer, and so he only brought fruits and vegetables, but God was really interested in Abel because he offered a lamb. But, first of all, we're not in the Old Testament system yet of these types of sacrifices that are offered in the temple. That hasn't been created yet. And also, sacrifices of fruits and grains and vegetables were completely acceptable in God's sight. So it's not the sacrifice itself. It's not the fact that he brought vegetables and this guy brought a pork chop, and God was more impressed with the pork, which I would be, with the pork chops than with the carrots, right? It wasn't the sacrifice itself. It wasn't about the things that they brought and laid before God. And often what happens is when we read this story, we get really sidetracked with stuff that doesn't matter, right? We get completely sidetracked with, okay, well, Cain's wicked, and so of course he's gonna do something wicked, and Abel's good, so Abel's gonna do something good, and we think about shepherds and we think, oh, the shepherds announced the birth of Jesus. So we have all these positive connotations with shepherds, but with farmers, we don't really have this positive connotation, right? In our minds, because we don't have that kind of typology that really stands out to us. And so we kind of start to choose sides based on the job that they have or based on what they're actually offering. Because we all know, oh, the high priest would offer a lamb, and so we think, oh, the blood sacrifice, the lamb sacrifice, that's the right thing to do. But that's even not the focus of what's going on here. This is the first time we're finding sacrifice being offered in this kind of way in the Bible. So God favored Abel's efforts, but not Cain's. And a sacrifice, so let's just break down what a sacrifice is. And this is a definition I heard that I thought was pretty good. And this applies to sacrifices in the Bible. It applies to sacrifices in our own lives, because we're not unfamiliar with sacrifices, right? Those of you who have children, you've made sacrifices, right? Those of you who are married, you've made sacrifices. Those of you who've moved, those of you who have worked any job whatsoever, those of you who have gone to school, you've made sacrifices of some sort. A sacrifice is an intentional and emphatic display of seriousness. So in the Old Testament, when you wanted to show that you were serious about something, that something was important, you made a sacrifice because it cost you something. Cain was wroth in verse 5. His face fell, which again is an old school way of saying he got really upset. And also, face represented someone's presence in kind of Old Testament language. We think of being removed in the latter half of this story. We find he's being removed from the face of God, right? Or from God's presence. But if there's anything we learned in Sunday school, that God's everywhere, right? So how can he be removed from God's presence when God's everywhere? Well, the idea is that we have God's presence, his omnipresence, that is, God is everywhere. But you also have the sense of God's presence of blessing. So you're in the sense of being in God's presence, you're in his favor. God's able to look on you, and you don't have to be afraid because you have this ability to be in God's presence, and you know that you're in right standing with him. So as soon as they offer these sacrifices, Cain finds that he is not pleasing to God, and he gets super upset about it. This word wroth can mean really, really angry. It can mean really deeply grieved. And it's the same word that's used when Jesus is talking to the rich young ruler. You guys remember that? When the rich young ruler, it's a tongue twister, says, "What do I have to do in order to follow you and to have eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Oh, okay. Yeah, sell everything that you have and come and follow me." And he got really upset because he had a lot of stuff, right? So minimalism was not a big thing back then, at least not choosing to be a minimalist. It was chosen for many of them. So it happens when you live in deep, deep poverty. So he's very upset because he had become attached to all the stuff that he had, all the money that he had, right? And he got very upset and he got deeply grieved because he wanted to follow Jesus, but he wanted his stuff more. And I can't think of a more appropriate culture to hear this message than America, right? We want Jesus, but we want him in the sense that he does something for us. We have a utilitarian view of God. We allow God into our life as long as it doesn't cost us anything, as long as we don't have to sacrifice, as long as we don't have to be uncomfortable, as long as he doesn't make us apologize for something stupid we said and it's going to be embarrassing, or that we have to tell someone about him and get embarrassed because they may think we're crazy or weak or stupid or something like that. And if it means that God will never let us live on the street, God will never let us be sick, God will make it so that we never have to stand over the grave of a loved one, we're okay with serving God as long as it doesn't cost us more than we're willing to pay. And for some of us, we have ideas of what we're willing to pay for God's presence and God's favor, and we have a line in the sand. Now, we would never express that out loud, because once we express it out loud, we have to admit it, right? And we're uncomfortable admitting if we're not living fully in God's presence, if we're not completely and totally dedicated to God. So here's what happens. Abel offers a sacrifice, God accepts it. We find in Hebrews 11:4 that by faith, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. And in 1 John 3, John says that Cain's actions were evil. Not that he offered squash and zucchini, right? But that his actions were evil. So how can we tell? You can tell by the reaction, right? So Cain offers this sacrifice. It wasn't accepted. God doesn't look on it with favor. He says, you're not doing it my way, you're doing it your way. Whether it's the wrong intentions, the wrong motive, something like that. We're not given all the specifics of why that is, because again, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if it was some mechanical issue or if he came with a heart that wasn't pure. All of that is fluff that doesn't actually matter to where the story's going. And the story's going, so every story you have an intro, right? So you get introduced to the characters and you kind of start to like them unless they're bad guys, and then you don't like them. And then you have some sort of drama that unfolds. You have some sort of, what's the word? Resistance or some sort of combat or something that goes wrong, right? For some reason I'm spacing on the word. You have some sort of tension. That's enough out of you, Joel, AKA Cain. So, as an older brother, I can completely understand Cain's motives here. I get where he's coming from. Just, you got to be sneaky about it, all right? You can't do it when God's watching. So there's something about this story that you have this tension of, oh man, you have two guys, which one's a good guy, which one's a bad guy, and you're just kind of waiting for it, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, cool, Abel's a good guy. All right, I know who to root for now. And then you're like, Cain, you're like, oh, Cain, I hate that guy, right? Because of the way the story's unfolding, everyone's just like, oh man, Cain, oh man, it sounds like a bad guy's name too, right? And so we have that tension. But then there's a climax where everything starts to build for this moment, right? Every story, every TV show, even episodes have their own tension. Then they have a climax, and then there's some sort of resolution. Whether it's the resolution you want or not is a completely different story. But we have this tension building, and the tension builds, and the pinnacle of this tension is when God comes to Cain. And I imagine he's sitting somewhere inside. He talks about sin lying at the door. So in my mind, he's sitting inside. And God comes to him and he says, why are you so upset? Okay, why are you furious right now? Why are you deeply depressed and grieved and upset? He said, if you do what you're supposed to do, if you do the right thing, I'm going to accept it. Right? What he's saying is, I don't have a personal vendetta with you. There's nothing inherently about you that makes me want to reject you. You're not doing it my way, you're doing it your way. And Abel did it my way, you're doing it your way. Get yourself right and do it my way, which you don't want to hear. Right? So if someone gets a promotion over you, right? Our immediate instinct sometimes is, oh, this is messed up. It's because they don't like me. It's we want to reach out for everything except for maybe, now this isn't always the case, but maybe that person's just better than you at the job. It could be. Maybe they put more hours in. Maybe they work harder. Maybe they have a better attitude, right? We never want to kind of incorporate that into our worldview. Something's got to be amiss. And of course, sometimes there are some shady things going on, obviously. But in order to have, maybe a good bill of health, it's probably not healthy to always look out at everyone else when something goes wrong, when we have the ability to fix it, right? And I'm speaking in very general terms, okay? Very general terms. But God comes to Cain, he says, dude, just do the right thing. And that's, of course, in the original Hebrew. Do us the right thing, bro. Maybe a paraphrase or two. But he said, if you do the right thing, you're going to be accepted. There's an if-then structure. If you do this, then you will be accepted. But if you don't, he doesn't say you won't be accepted. He says, if you don't do the right thing, you can fix this. It's not too late. He says, but if you choose not to, he says, sin lieth at the door. Now, a couple of things going on here. And I'm just about done. So just because we're in verse 7 doesn't mean we're going to be here for a hot minute. Sin lieth at the door. Another way of phrasing this would be, so when we think of lieth, we think of some old hound dog who's laying at the outdoor halfway asleep, right? Tongue flapped over his face, ears sideways, right? Drooling into a bowl of water. Sin lieth at the door. A better way of saying that is crouching, prepared to strike. And I'm not going to bore you with the grammar. I like grammar. I'm a massive nerd, okay? I'm wearing a tie, after all. So, and I have glasses. Come on. So, there is an idea of sin crouching at the door. But it's not just inanimate, sin's waiting outside in some kind of, ethereal form or something. The imagery used is perhaps of a spiritual force or demon or some sort of spiritual enemy that is crouching outside. It's anthropomorphized. That is, taking something that's not physical or not human and making it sound like it is, right? So making it sound like if you have a tree the tree was reaching its branches over to provide shade on the sidewalk, right? Trees don't reach out and do anything, right? But you're making it sound like a human so that it animates it. So that's what he's saying. He's saying there's a presence outside and it's not for you. It's against you. He says, and unto thee shall be his desire. Now that's a really confusing way of saying he wants to control you, right? And it's interesting, it says his desire. So the word sin is feminine. So it can't be his. It's the crouching. So the idea is there's a crouching something or other out there, and it wants to control you, and it wants to possess you is one of the ideas, and it wants to put you into its service. So that's an option. You can do the right thing, or there is a presence outside that's waiting for you to choose it, and then it's going to control you. He says, but you need to rule over that. It's the same idea of Adam and Eve having dominion over the earth. You need to control the animals, right? Care for them, all those sorts of things. He's saying there's something outside that wants to take you, and it wants to possess you, and it wants to use you for its benefit. And if you don't change your attitude, that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, those are harsh words for someone who basically God just embarrassed in front of his little brother and said, your sacrifice is not good enough. You're not coming my way. So God comes to him and with some tough love says, you need to get your act straight, and you need to come to me and get your sacrifice right. Because if you don't, something very serious is going to happen. So then Cain decides to go talk to his brother. They go out in a field, and then the Bible says he rises up and he kills his brother. Now, there's a lot of stories and fables about maybe he used the jawbone of a donkey or maybe he used a rock or whatever. None of that's mentioned because, again, it doesn't matter, right? We don't want to lose sight, right? Remember I told you at the beginning how focused this story is? Cain, Abel. And the only reason you have Abel is to be a contrast against Cain. Almost every time you see Abel's name, it's Abel, your brother. Almost every time you find Abel, it's Abel, your brother. So he's constantly attaching himself. And what God's doing is he's having Abel as the ideal, the goal, right? What you're supposed to be. That's the ideal. And he's comparing Abel to Cain, and he's saying, you're not meeting up to the standard. You're not meeting up to the expectation that I have for you. And he doesn't like that. Anytime we have a goal, anytime we have something that we set above us, any ideal that we have, like a life of holiness, a life of compassion for others, a life of service, that inherently judges where we are now. Does that make sense? Right? So anytime you have a goal and you don't reach that goal kind of judges you, right? If you set a goal and you're like, all right, I'm going to lose 10 pounds by March, and I'm going to start in January, and then by February, you don't even remember how to get to the gym anymore. You lost the card to get in, right? The treadmill's become a hat rack, and you got all your coats on it, right? Your running shoes, you haven't seen them. I mean, the dog got them. So, right? And then you get to March and you're reminded of, oh man, I was going to lose 10 pounds by March, and that goal starts to judge you, right? You start to feel the pressure from that ideal that you set. God, just the presence of God alone, the fact that he is so perfect, is automatically judging us. Now, the word judge has become negative in our society. You can't disagree with someone without being a judge or a Pharisee or something, right? Everyone's getting their feelings hurt because you're being judged by someone, right? But we're always being judged by that which we think is ideal. That which we place above us, and we're like, that's the goal. That's the ideal. It's constantly judging us, and that's how it should be because we're not there yet. Cain felt judged. What did he do? It's the same thing that we do whenever we feel constantly judged by something and we continue to fail to meet the standard. We eliminate that. Cain killed his ideal. His brother was the ideal. It was the one he was compared to and contrasted with as this is what you should be. This is the type of sacrifice I want you to offer. And when you have that ideal and you never meet it, right? This is why it's so dangerous to say that you're a Christian and to never make progress, to never show fruit, to never read your Bible, to never pray. You're constantly sitting in a state of judgment based on your lack of relationship with God, what you know the Bible says, and yet how you're living. when we constantly sit in that state, we're consistently judged by that ideal. And you don't live your whole life just sitting there being judged by that ideal. It can lead to depression. It can lead to severe anxiety, just from a psychological perspective. It can lead to you not wanting to come to church anymore. Why? Because you missed 2 Sundays and everyone's going to look at you weird when you show back up. Right? You have that sense of being judged by everything and by everyone. Pretty soon, if you're able to, you eliminate that judge. Pretty soon, you no longer set goals for yourself, because goals mean there's a tangible way to see if you've been successful. And a person who hides from that doesn't want to know. They don't want that. They don't want to be judged by that. And so what Cain does is he eliminates the threat. He eliminates the ideal. He sacrifices the ideal. And God warns him. It reminds me of 1 Peter 5:8, when Jesus told Peter, he said, or when Peter said, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Right? Pay attention, he says. There's that sense of imminent threat. So what does God want? How does he want us to respond? He wants us to do controlled burns. We're coming full circle with that. One of 2 things will happen if you live with sin in your life. So let's just break it down, okay? Let's break it down to this. One of 2 things will happen if you continue to live with sin in your life. Open sin, things that you know. I'm not talking about being perfect. I'm not talking about you make a mistake every now and then, right? You're dealing with certain things. I understand that. But if you live in a state of unrepentant sin in your life, one of 2 things will happen. Number 1, you will eventually meet that ideal that you have set. You will eventually get right with God. You will confess your sin. You will come to him, and you will start to do things his way instead of your way. Or number 2, you will remove yourself from the presence of that ideal. You will destroy that ideal. If you ever find yourself becoming overly critical, right? This is how you can tell when you're starting to destroy the ideal in your life. Okay? So I hope this comes back to you someday when you're thinking about this. If you constantly find yourself lashing out and getting overly critical about your church, about your pastor, or about the people in your church, about Christians in general, Christians you see on TV, if you find yourself always being critical, right? So if we see people who aren't living right, televangelists who have $30 million jets, or they have people in their church who are starving to death, and they have $30 million jet, we should call that out, right? Exorbitant wealth that does not lead to generosity. We should call that out. I understand that. But focus on what I'm saying here. If you find yourself getting overly critical of people that you know are Christians, and all of a sudden they can do no right, right? We need to realize that is the ideal that's judging us. It's not that person all of a sudden becoming annoying to you. It's the fact that we find ourselves in the presence of the ideal. And the ideal is that judge that stands over us. Every goal we set, right? Every person that we aspire to be like as a Christian, and that's okay, right? To have people you look up to in the faith, right? Understanding that they're sinners, right? They're just trying to live for the Lord the best they can the way you do. But if you find yourself getting overly critical and you bounce from church to church to church because just no churches are right. None of these pastors are right. No one's really living right, right? It could be that you're attempting to destroy the ideal in your life. This is how atheists are made. They claim a belief in God. Sometimes they claim a belief in God, right? They don't live up to that standard for whatever reason. They get wroth and their countenance falls, and they get upset and they get bitter, and they start to attack all of the Christianity that's around them. Why? Because it's an ideal that judges them. Not that Christianity itself is judging them, not that you're pointing at them and laughing or, saying things about them. It's the fact that the presence alone is an ideal that judges you. All right, so you cannot, we must do controlled burns because we must burn away that which doesn't please God in our life. And it's painful, and we don't like it, and it's going to be uncomfortable. This isn't going to be some cool Hallmark movie where we have the cool montage, right? And the Rocky soundtrack's playing, and you're shadow boxing with the devil, right? And everything is peachy keen. It's going to take getting up early. It's going to take apologizing to people you don't want to apologize to. It's going to take mending fences. It's going to take being humble, and it's going to be painful. emotionally, psychologically, hopefully not physically. You might be doing it wrong. But you cannot be who you want to become and then also be who you are right now simultaneously. Sacrifice, right, is the laying down of who we are in order to become who we want to become. A burning away of the old, right? Don't let those sins fester until there's an uncontrollable fire that you can't destroy, that you can't get rid of, and it burns away any hope of you living a meaningful life for Christ. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. I pray that you'll help us to be attentive to it. Speak to us, and you know the words that we need to hear, and continue to be with us this week. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.